They laughed that she'd crush any husband. He said he'd take his chances. The air in Miller's Mercantile in the year of our Lord 1880 was thick with the trinity of prairie commerce, the sweet dark breath of molasses, the sharp tang of new leather, and the pervasive flour-fine dust of Kansas itself. It was a masculine space, a place of low murmurs and hard-eyed transactions. Della Roark, standing by the bolt of undyed muslin, was an island in this sea of men, a mountain where the world expected a hill. At 28, she was taller than any man in the room, with shoulders that spoke of hauling water and a quiet strength that the town's men chose to interpret as a threat. They did not see the woman, they saw only her size, a fact of nature they found both inconvenient and deeply amusing. "Look at her," Jedediah Kane muttered, his voice a conspiratorial rasp meant to carry. "Be like bedding down with a grizzly. A man would need a map to find his way, and a prayer to get out alive." A wave of low, cruel laughter rippled through the store. The men, leaning against barrels and counters, turned their humor upon her like a weapon. "The man who weds Della Roark," another chimed in, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near the pot-bellied stove, "best be buried with a shovel. She'll crush him flat on their wedding night." The laughter grew louder, uglier. Della felt the heat rise in her face, a familiar scalding shame. She had heard variations of this joke her entire life. It was the anthem of her solitude. She kept her eyes fixed on the muslin, her large, capable hands clenched so tightly the knuckles were white. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. She would stand there, absorb the blows of their words, and then she would walk out, as she always did, alone. Then, a new voice cut through the noise. It was not loud, but it had the weight of stone. "I'll take my chances." The laughter sputtered and died. Every head turned toward the man who had spoken. Boone Tasker stood near the door, a sack of flour slung over one shoulder. He was a man made of prairie grit and silence, his face weathered by sun and sorrow, his eyes the pale, washed-out blue of a winter sky. He was a widower who kept to his remote ranch and spoke so little the town had nearly forgotten the sound of his voice. He looked directly at the clutch of men, his gaze flat and unreadable. He did not issue a challenge. He stated a fact. He shifted the sack of flour, the movement effortless, and walked to the counter. He set his own goods down and then looked at Della, a long, steady look that held no pity and no mockery. It was a look of simple assessment, of seeing. "Miss Roark," he said, his voice quiet but clear in the sudden, ringing silence. "Whatever you're needing, put it with mine." Della stared at him, her heart a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She could not process the words. It was a rescue so unexpected, so contrary to the laws of her world, that it felt like a dream. The men, including Jedediah Kane, were frozen in a state of stunned disbelief. Boone Tasker ignored them all. He was looking at her, waiting. With trembling hands, she gestured to the muslin. The shopkeeper, his eyes wide, measured and cut the fabric, his movements clumsy in the weighted silence. Boone paid in coin, the clink on the wooden counter the only sound. He gathered his things, then took her parcel of cloth from the shopkeeper and held it out, not to her, but as if to carry it for her. He nodded once toward the door and walked out into the blinding Kansas sun, leaving the men of the town in a silence of their own making. He did not look back to see if she would follow. He simply trusted that she would. The wagon ride to Boone Tasker's ranch was a journey measured in the creak of wood and the rhythmic plod of the horse's hooves. Della sat on the hard bench beside him, the parcel of muslin on her lap, a fragile shield against the enormity of what was happening. She did not know the rules for this. Her life had been a simple, painful equation of enduring mockery and returning to the solitude of the small room she rented from a grudging aunt. This man, this quiet stranger, had shattered that equation with 5 simple words. Now, she was adrift in the aftermath, bracing for the inevitable punchline. Surely this grand gesture was just a new, more elaborate form of joke, one whose cruelty would be revealed in private. Boone did not speak. He kept his eyes on the endless horizon, his hands sure on the reins. The prairie stretched out around them, a vast, indifferent canvas of brown and gold under a sky too big for a single soul. When he finally turned the wagon off the main track and onto a smaller, less traveled path, she saw his home. It was not a grand place. It was a small, solid cabin built of cottonwood logs, chinked with mud, with a stone chimney and a sturdy-looking barn set a little ways off. It was a place built for endurance, not for show. It looked like the man himself, weathered, solitary, and rooted deep in the earth. He pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. "This is it," he said, the words seeming to cost him some effort. He came around and offered a hand to help her down. His hand was rough, calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. She allowed him to help her, feeling the shocking solidity of his grip. He led her inside. The cabin was one room, spare but immaculately clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a simple table and 2 chairs stood in the center, and a bed was tucked into a corner. Against the far wall, a smaller cot had been freshly made up with a clean blanket. "That'll be yours," he said, nodding toward the cot. He set her parcel down upon it. "There's water in the basin. I've got chores to see to." And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the quiet space. Della stood frozen, her senses taking in the details of her new, bewildering reality. The room smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and clean linen. There was no clutter, no sign of another person's life, save for a small, faded tintype of a woman on the mantelpiece, a woman with large, dark eyes and a fragile smile. Della looked away, feeling like an intruder. She expected him to return, to begin the interrogation, the explanation, the joke. But the hours passed in a slow, steady rhythm of silence. Through the single window, she watched him. He moved with an economy of motion, mending a fence, tending to his horses, his form a dark silhouette against the setting sun. He did not look toward the cabin. He did not check on her. He simply worked, granting her the profound and unfamiliar gift of being left alone. When dusk finally fell, he came inside, his face streaked with dirt. He washed at the basin, then set about making a simple supper of bacon and beans. He placed a plate before her at the table, then sat opposite, eating without a word. The silence was not empty. It was a living thing, a space he was offering her, a place to simply be, without the need for performance or defense. For the first time in her life, Della Roark ate a meal in the company of a man, and did not feel the weight of his judgment. She was only a woman, eating bread, in a quiet room, and it was the most extraordinary peace she had ever known. In the days that followed, a silent routine settled over the ranch, as natural and unforced as the turning of the earth. Boone would rise before the sun, his movements quiet, so as not to wake her. Della, a light sleeper by habit, would hear the soft scrape of his boots on the floorboards, the splash of water at the basin, and would lie still on her cot, listening to the world come alive around his steady presence. He would leave coffee warming on the stove, a silent offering, before heading out to the barn. She would rise in the gray light of dawn, dress, and take the coffee to the porch, watching him work. He never asked for her help, but she could not sit idle. She started with small things, tending the meager vegetable garden, feeding the chickens, mending one of his shirts that had a tear at the elbow. He would return for the midday meal to find the table set and food prepared. He would nod his thanks, his pale eyes meeting hers for a brief, appraising moment, and they would eat in their customary quiet. Della watched him, learning the language of his movements. She saw the gentleness in his hands when he checked a horse's hoof, the patience in his posture as he repaired a harness. He was a man who communicated through action, his goodness a thing to be witnessed, not heard. She, in turn, began to unfold in the safety of his silence. The rigid set of her shoulders softened. The perpetual brace against insult she had carried for years began to ease. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the moment when his kindness would curdle into the familiar mockery. But it never came. He treated her not as a guest or a burden, but as a simple fact of his landscape, as elemental as the wind and the sun. The prairie tested them. A late spring blizzard, a vicious, unseasonable beast of wind and snow, descended upon them with shocking speed. It howled out of a slate-gray sky, burying the world in a blinding whiteness. One of his cows had calved just the day before, and in the chaos of getting the small herd to the barn, the newborn was lost. Boone came inside, his face grim, shaking the snow from his coat. "The calf's gone," he said, his voice raw from the wind. "Can't see a foot in front of my face. The mother's raising hell, but it's no use. It'll be frozen solid in an hour." He slumped by the fire, the picture of defeat. But Della felt a strange hum under her skin, a deep, instinctual pull. She had always felt the weather in her bones, a connection to the land that other people dismissed as foolishness. Without a word, she pulled on his spare heavy coat, which fit her broad shoulders perfectly, wrapped a scarf around her head, and walked to the door. Boone looked up, his eyes wide with alarm. "What are you doing? You'll die out there." She didn't answer. She simply opened the door and stepped into the maelstrom. The wind tore at her, a physical blow, but she leaned into it, her size an anchor against its fury. Boone, cursing, grabbed his own coat and plunged into the whiteout after her. He expected her to wander aimlessly, but she moved with a strange and unnerving purpose, heading not toward the pasture but toward a small, eroded ravine to the east of the barn. He could barely see her, a large, dark shape moving through the swirling chaos. He followed, trusting the instinct he saw in her determined stride. She stopped at the edge of the ravine, peering down. And there, tucked under an overhang, shivering but alive, was the calf. It was a place he would never have thought to look. Before he could even scramble down the slope, Della had slid down, gathered the animal into her arms as if it weighed nothing, and begun the arduous climb back up. He watched, stunned into silence, as she carried the half-frozen calf, a weight that would have strained him to his limits, all the way back to the barn, her body a bulwark against the storm. She laid it gently on a bed of clean hay and began rubbing it vigorously to bring back its life. Boone stood in the doorway of the barn, the wind howling behind him, and looked at her not with pity or curiosity, but with a profound and soul-shaking awe. He had taken her in as a rebuke to the cruelty of small men. He saw now that he had taken in a force of nature. The blizzard raged for 2 days, encasing the small cabin in a world of white silence. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, a warm, beating heart against the storm's cold fury. The rescued calf was safe with its mother in the barn, a small miracle secured by Della's strength and instinct. The shared crisis had shifted the air between them, charging it with an unspoken intimacy. They sat at the table, the flickering firelight casting long shadows on the walls, the howl of the wind a constant, low moan outside. It was Boone who finally broke the long silence, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "My wife," he began, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames, not on her. Her name was Alara. He reached for the small tintype on the mantel and held it in his calloused palm, studying the face of the fragile, dark-eyed woman. She was small, like a sparrow. I used to think I could hold her whole being in my 2 hands. He paused, the memory a heavy weight in the room. I loved that about her, her delicateness. I thought it was my job to be the wall between her and the world. He set the picture down gently. But this land, it doesn't care for delicate things. It's too big, too hard. The wind never stops, the sun beats you down in summer, the cold freezes the marrow in your bones in winter. It wore on her. A fever took her 2 years ago. The doctor said a stronger person might have fought it off. I brought her here, to this place that was too much for her. I loved her for being a sparrow, and then I watched the hawk take her. I've been alone with that ever since. He finally looked at Della, his pale blue eyes filled with a raw, unguarded sorrow. "When I saw you in that store, when I heard those men, they were laughing at your strength. And all I could think was, there is a woman the prairie can't break. There is a woman who is strong enough for this life. I wasn't offering you pity, Della. I was offering you a place you might not have to fight so hard just to stand your ground." His confession was a key, unlocking a door inside her she had kept bolted for a lifetime. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and unfamiliar. And then she spoke. Her voice, husky from disuse, filled the small cabin. "They've called me names since I was a girl. Ox, Giantus, Big Della. My own mother used to sigh every time she had to let out the seams on my dresses. She said no man would ever want a woman who cast a shadow bigger than his own." She looked down at her hands, spread on the tabletop. They were not delicate. They were hands made for work, for lifting, for holding on. The laughter in the store, it wasn't a new pain. It was just the loudest echo of all the whispers I've lived with. "I came here with you because it was better than staying there. But I thought you were just making a point. That soon enough, you'd find a way to make the same joke, just quieter." She finally met his gaze, her own vulnerability a mirror to his. "No one has ever looked at my strength and called it a good thing." He didn't offer platitudes or easy comfort. He simply nodded, a gesture of profound understanding. He had shown her his wound, and she had shown him hers. In the heart of the storm, by the light of the fire, two solitary souls sat across from each other and saw, for the first time, not what the world had made of them, but what they truly were, survivors. Weeks turned into a month. The fierce blizzard gave way to a gentle, greening spring. A fragile trust, planted in the shared vulnerability of that stormy night, began to take root and grow in the quiet soil of their daily lives. Della no longer felt like a guest. The cabin had begun to feel like a shared space, a sanctuary they were building together, word by word, gesture by gesture. But the world outside their small patch of land had not forgotten them. One afternoon, a buggy crested the rise, stirring up a cloud of dust. Della's heart seized with a familiar dread. It was the town preacher, Reverend Miller, accompanied by Jedediah Kane and another of the town's self-appointed moral guardians. Boone saw them coming and walked out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. He stood at the top of the steps, his posture relaxed but unyielding, a silent sentinel. Della watched from behind the cabin's lace-curtained window, her hands clenched in the folds of her apron. The men climbed down from the buggy, their faces a mixture of pious concern and smug righteousness. "Boone," the preacher began, clearing his throat, "we've come out of concern, for your soul and for the situation here." He gestured vaguely toward the cabin, where Della was a half-seen shadow. "The town is talking. A woman, unmarried, living under your roof. It's not proper. It sets a poor example." Jedediah Kane smirked, his eyes glinting with malice. "Folks are saying you've taken in a stray, Boone. A rather large stray. We're here to remind you of your Christian duty, and hers." The implication was ugly and clear. She was a fallen woman, and Boone's charity was suspect. The same men who had mocked her for being unmarriageable were now condemning her for the very arrangement their cruelty had necessitated. Boone let the silence stretch. He looked from the preacher's sanctimonious face to Kane's sneer, his own expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet, stripped of all emotion save for a cold, hard certainty. "Della Roark is not a stray," he said, his eyes locking on to the preacher's. "She is a guest in my home. A few weeks ago, during that blizzard, she walked into a storm that I wouldn't face and saved a calf I had given up for dead. Her hands have healed my animals and tended my garden. Her strength, which you and your friends find so amusing, is a blessing. A gift from a God who knows what it takes to survive out here." He took a step forward, to the very edge of the porch, looking down at them. You're not here out of concern for my soul, Reverend. You're here because you're uncomfortable. Because she doesn't fit the small shape you've made for a woman in your minds. You're welcome to come to this porch to apologize to her for your behavior at the mercantile. But if you've come to cast judgment, the road back to town is that way. He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he delivered the final, decisive blow. This is her home now. And I am her husband in all ways that matter to God and to this land. You can tell the town that. The men were stunned into silence. They had come expecting a stammering, isolated widower they could easily intimidate. They found instead a man of absolute moral conviction, faced with his quiet, unshakable authority. Their own righteousness seemed petty and small. Reverend Miller mumbled something about a misunderstanding. Jedediah Kane just glared, his face mottled with fury and humiliation. Without another word, they climbed back into their buggy and retreated down the dusty track, leaving a profound and ringing silence in their wake. Della, still standing at the window, felt a single tear trace a path down her cheek. No one in her entire life had ever stood for her. The echo of Boone's declaration, "I am her husband in all ways that matter," hung in the air between them long after the buggy's dust had settled. It was a foundation stone laid, a truth spoken aloud that could not be taken back. That evening, the usual comfortable silence of the cabin was charged with a new, tremulous energy. They ate their supper, the familiar ritual now imbued with a different meaning. Every glance held a question, every shared moment a confirmation. They were no longer just two people sharing a roof. They were a fortress of two, defined against the world. After the meal, as Boone stoked the fire, Della went to the small wooden chest that held her few belongings. Her fingers brushed past worn work clothes until they found what she was looking for. A simple dress of undyed muslin, the very fabric Boone had purchased for her on that first day. It was the only garment she owned that was not patched or stained from labor. She had sewn it herself, its lines plain and serviceable, a dress for a woman who never expected to have an occasion to wear it. It was a symbol of her stark, unadorned life. She held the dress up, its pale form luminous in the firelight. Boone turned from the hearth and saw her. He understood immediately. His gaze softened. He walked to the mantelpiece and picked up a small, carved wooden box, Alara's box. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, precious item, a length of delicate, handmade lace, yellowed with age, intricate as a spider's web. It was a piece of his past, a remnant of a love he had cherished and lost. He lifted the lace from the box with a reverence that made Della's breath catch in her throat. He didn't speak. He walked to her and simply held it out, an offering. Della looked from the lace in his hand to the profound tenderness in his eyes. This was more than a gift. It was a bridge between his past and their future. He was not asking her to replace Alara, but to join him in building something new, weaving the threads of what was into what could be. Her hand trembled as she took the lace from him. Its delicate texture was a startling contrast to her own strong, calloused fingers. She sat in the rocker by the fire, the plain muslin dress across her lap, and with a needle and thread from her sewing kit, she began to stitch the antique lace onto the collar and cuffs. The work was slow, meticulous. Each stitch was a silent vow, an acceptance of his unspoken proposal. He did not return to his chores. He pulled up the other chair and sat beside her, watching her hands work. He was not watching a seamstress. He was witnessing a ceremony. Under the quiet gaze of her future husband, in the warm glow of their shared hearth, Della Roark transformed the symbol of her plainness into a wedding gown. The fire bore witness as two broken people mended their lives together, one careful, hopeful stitch at a time. They did not marry in the cold stone church in town, under the judgmental gaze of Reverend Miller and his flock. They chose their own sanctuary. Boone found a traveling circuit rider, a weary man with kind eyes, and a dusty coat, and asked him to perform the service. They were married on a Tuesday morning, under the sprawling branches of a lone cottonwood tree on a rise that overlooked the vast rolling sea of the prairie. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and a gentle wind whispered through the tall grass, the land itself serving as their witness. Della wore her transformed dress. The antique lace at her throat was soft against her skin, a delicate testament to a future woven from the past. Boone wore a clean shirt and his least-worn trousers. He stood straighter than she had ever seen him, a quiet solemnity etched on his weathered face. The circuit rider's words were simple, the traditional vows spoken into the immense quiet of the open plains. But when Boone took her hand to say, to have, and to hold, his calloused fingers wrapped around hers with a sense of permanent, protective right. His gaze was not on her face, but on their joined hands, a symbol of the partnership he had sought, the strength he had honored. When it was Della's turn, her voice was low but steady. In sickness and in health, she vowed, and in her mind, she saw him feverish in his bed, saw herself tending to him, the roles of protector and protected already blurred and reformed. The words were not an abstract promise, they were a description of a reality they had already lived. The preacher pronounced them man and wife, and then, with a nod, stepped back to give them a moment. A lifetime of flinching from touch, of bracing for blows both physical and verbal, had made Della wary of intimacy. She expected Boone to lean in, to claim his husbandly right with a kiss. But he did not. He simply stood before her, his pale eyes searching hers, his face full of a reverent wonder. He was waiting for her. He was giving her the choice. In that moment of profound respect, the last of her walls crumbled. This man would never crush her. He would only ever seek to lift her up. Slowly, Della raised her hand, the same hand that could lift a calf and steady a rifle, and placed it gently against his rough cheek. His skin was warm from the sun. He closed his eyes for a second, leaning into her touch as if it were a benediction. It was the first time she had ever willingly initiated such a contact. It was an act of supreme trust, a claiming of him as he had claimed her. Then, she leaned down, and he rose to meet her. The kiss was not a thing of fire and passion. It was something far deeper. It was the quiet, certain click of a key turning in a lock. It was a promise of safety, a seal on a covenant of mutual sanctuary. It tasted of dust and sun, and the faintest hint of salt from a single, happy tear that escaped her eye. The prairie wind seemed to quiet, holding its breath, and for the first time, Della Roark felt like she was truly, finally home. The peace they forged was a quiet, sturdy thing, built day by day. But the malice of the town had not been extinguished, it had merely been banked, waiting for a wind to stir its embers. Jedediah Kane, humiliated by Boone's public rebuke, nurtured his grudge like a foul garden. He could not abide the sight of Boone's quiet happiness, nor could he comprehend a woman like Della being anything other than a monster or a curse. His bitterness, watered with whiskey, finally bloomed into a plan for ugly vengeance. He gathered a few other resentful, drunken souls, men whose own lives were small and mean, and convinced them that Boone and his giantess wife were an affront to the natural order of things. They came at night, their faces illuminated by the demonic, flickering light of torches. They rode not with the grim purpose of righteous men, but with the loud, cowardly bravado of a mob. Della and Boone were woken by the frantic barking of their dog and the terrifying sound of splintering wood. Boone was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his trousers. "Stay inside," he commanded, grabbing his rifle from its rack by the door. But Della could see the orange glow through the window, could smell the acrid smoke. They were setting fire to the barn. The animals, their livelihood, their charges were trapped. Before Boone could stop her, she was right behind him. He burst out of the cabin, firing a warning shot into the air. "Get off my land," he roared, his voice a thunderclap of fury. The drunken men laughed. Jedediah Kane, emboldened by liquor and the cover of darkness, raised his own pistol. "We're just here to cleanse this place, Tasker. Send that witch of yours out." Boone didn't waste more words. He ran toward the barn, intent on unlatching the doors and freeing the terrified animals. As he ran, a shot rang out, sharp and venomous. Boone cried out and stumbled, clutching his shoulder as he fell to the hard-packed earth. Della saw it happen from the cabin doorway, and something inside her snapped. The years of fear, the lifetime of shame, it all burned away in a white-hot surge of protective rage. This man, her husband, the only person who had ever seen her true worth, was hurt. They had hurt him. She moved without thinking. She snatched Boone's heavy hunting rifle from where he dropped it just inside the door. It was heavy, unfamiliar in her hands, but her grip was sure. She strode out onto the porch, a towering figure silhouetted against the roaring flames of the burning barn. She raised the rifle to her shoulder, its weight settling comfortably against the solid muscle there. She did not aim at any man. She was not a killer. She aimed at the ground just in front of Jedediah Kane's feet. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was a deafening cannon blast that ripped through the night. The bullet kicked up a plume of dirt that sprayed against Kane's boots. The drunken men froze. They saw her then, truly saw her, a giant of a woman, face grim and terrible in the firelight, wielding a weapon with an unnerving steadiness. The creature of their jokes had become a figure of wrathful power. Their whiskey-fueled courage evaporated in an instant. With panicked shouts, they scrambled for their horses and fled into the darkness, leaving only the crackle of the burning barn and the wounded man on the ground behind them. Della dropped the rifle and ran to her husband's side. The rescued had become the rescuer. With a strength born of love and fury, she gathered Boone into her arms and carried him back to the sanctuary of their home. The night was a long, harrowing vigil. Della barred the cabin door and carried Boone to their bed, laying him down with a gentleness that belied the immense strength she had just displayed. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his shoulder, a painful but not mortal wound, yet he was losing blood and already slipping into the gray fog of shock. All the calm competence she possessed rose to the surface. She lit every lamp in the cabin, chasing the shadows to the corners. She tore strips from a clean linen sheet for bandages and boiled water to cleanse the wound. Her large hands, so often a source of shame, were now instruments of healing, steady, deft, and infinitely careful. She worked by lamplight, cleaning the entry and exit wounds, her focus absolute. She remembered the wild herbs she had seen growing near the creek, plants her grandmother had taught her were good for preventing putrefaction. She had gathered some and dried them, just in case. Now, she ground them into a paste and applied it as a poultice before binding the shoulder tightly. Boone was mostly unconscious, his breathing shallow. Once, in his delirium, his head thrashed on the pillow and he murmured a name, a ghost from his past. Elara. A younger Della might have felt a stab of pain, the sting of being second. But the woman who sat by his bed, her hands stained with his blood, felt only a wave of compassion. She placed a cool, damp cloth on his forehead. "Shh," she whispered, her voice a low anchor in his sea of pain. "It's Della. I'm here. You're safe." It was not a plea, but a statement of fact. She was claiming her place, not as a replacement for the woman he had lost, but as the woman who would keep him from being lost now. For the next 2 days, she was a tireless guardian. She managed the ranch alone, her grief for the burned barn subsumed by the urgent needs of the present. She milked their lone cow, who had escaped the fire, her movements rhythmic and soothing. She salvaged what she could from the smoldering ruins, her face grim. And every few hours she returned to the cabin to check on Boone, to change his dressing, to coax sips of water and broth between his lips. She sat by his bed in the long, quiet hours, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, feeling a fierce, primal love she had never known she was capable of. It was a love forged in fire and tempered by fear, and it was stronger than any wall she had ever built around her heart. On the morning of the third day, Boone's fever broke. He woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the window and the sight of Della asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head resting on her arms, her powerful frame slumped in exhaustion. He reached out with his good hand and laid it over hers. Her hand was so much larger than his, warm and strong. Her eyes fluttered open. They looked at each other in the quiet morning light. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice raspy. A small, weary smile touched her lips. "We save each other," she replied. It was the simple, unvarnished truth of their union. He saw not a giantess, but his wife, his protector, his partner. The ashes of their barn were a testament to the world's cruelty, but the steadfast love in that small cabin was proof of their own unconquerable strength. A year passed, the seasons turning the Kansas prairie from the tender green of rebirth to the burnished gold of harvest. The burned-out shell of the old barn was gone. In its place stood a new one, larger and stronger than the first, built by Boone's recovering hands and Della's unwavering strength. They had raised it together, beam by beam, a monument to their shared resilience. The project had filled the summer, their joint labor a silent conversation, each swing of the hammer a defiance of the men who had tried to destroy them. The town left them alone now. The story of Della and the rifle had grown into a local legend, a cautionary tale for those who would mistake quiet strength for weakness. It was autumn. A crispness tinged the air, and the cottonwood by the creek was a blaze of yellow. Della sat on the porch steps, a large bowl in her lap, her hands methodically shucking corn. The rhythmic rasp and snap was a peaceful domestic sound. Boone sat in a chair nearby, his shoulder now only a dull ache in the cold, carving a piece of scrap wood with his pocket knife. He had a slight limp now, a permanent reminder of the night he'd nearly been lost, a night that had bound them together with something stronger than vows. The silence between them was no longer a space of observation, but one of deep, abiding comfort. The easy quiet of two people who know each other's souls without the need for words. Della paused in her work, her hands coming to rest on her abdomen, where the curve of her belly was now softly, unmistakably round beneath her apron. She looked out over the fields, over the land that had once seemed so vast and intimidating. Now it did not feel empty. It felt full of promise. It felt like a cradle. Boone looked up from his carving, his eyes following her gaze, and then returning to her, to the gentle swell of her stomach. A slow, rare smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. The child growing within her was a new planting, a life conceived not in spite of who they were, but because of it. It was a promise rooted in the very strength he had recognized in a dusty mercantile, a future taking hold in the heart of their sanctuary. The world had laughed, certain that a woman of her size would crush any man foolish enough to marry her. But the world, with its small, cruel measures, had been wrong. Della Roark Tasker had not crushed her husband. She had lifted him up. She had carried him from the fire. She had healed him. And now, she carried their future. Love, it turned out, was not about finding someone who fit the world's narrow confines. It was about finding the one person who saw the true, expansive measure of your spirit and finally called you home. Boone finished his carving. He had made a small, perfect bird, its wings poised for flight. He leaned over and placed it gently into her open palm. It was a small, delicate thing, made for a strong, steady hand to hold.